Good evening, everyone. It's just about 6 o'clock. As always, I will give folks another minute or two to trickle into the room. Please continue to write where you're joining us from in the chat. We love to see it. So far, we've got a lot of folks joining us from Shelter Island, which is lovely. And all over Long Island. Oh, and Connecticut. And I did see one person from Washington Heights so far. Ooh, Yonkers.
Oh.
Troy. It's so interesting how for each talk, we get a really interesting mix of people from all over.
Wow.
All right. Well, it's 6:02, so I'll try to be punctual and start just about on time. So I'll just dive right in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual lecture series, Talking About Race Matters. Join the conversation. I'm Meredith Horsford. I'm the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are happy to continue this series, which we started last August, and it was very successful then, so we're really happy to be continuing it. This time we're doing a 6-week series during Black History Month, which shares the stories of New York's Black history each week with a different speaker. Race has been an important and influential topic in the past and in the present, which is the reason that we began this series. We feel that it is important to facilitate these conversations with experts, even though sometimes they can be challenging conversations. Each week, we will look at the topic of race from a different perspective. Last summer, we heard from anthropologists, a historian, and an archaeologist. And our goal throughout the series has been and continues to be to encourage everyone to come together, learn from one another, and to continue the conversation. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping tips about Crowdcast that we're using, the platform we're using tonight. You'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a chat box where you've all been communicating already. If you have any technical assistance questions, please feel free to write them in that chat box on the right. And Melissa, our Development and Community Engagement Manager, will try to assist you with them. Also, if you have questions for our speaker tonight, there is a Ask a Question button at the bottom center of your screen, which you can click on and type in your question. I will likely get to all of the questions at the very end. Also, we just want to thank everyone for attending. We've had a great turnout for these events. And we feel very strongly that our programming remains free of charge, so that is accessible to everyone. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support these programs. This event has been made possible in part with a sponsorship by TD Bank. This series is also made possible in part by funding from the New York Community Trust, a Humanities New York CARES grant with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Federal CARES Act. We are grateful for their contributions, which have assisted in the continued success of this series. If you would like to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and donations of in any amount are greatly appreciated. The donate button is at the bottom of the screen. Also, we would love to let you know, as I mentioned last week, we've got this really great t-shirt that my awesome, amazing staff has designed that will be shared. The link to see it will be shared in the chat on the right-hand side. It features the names of the enslaved and free people who lived and worked on the Dyckman farm on the front of the t-shirt. And on the back, it says, say their names. And so we'll be posting, thank you, Melissa, a link to if you'd like to buy that to support our programming. So proceeds from the t-shirt sales will go towards continuing to further the research that we're doing on enslaved and free people on the property, and also programming like this. So tonight, we are joined by the lovely Donnamarie Barnes, curator and archivist at the Sylvester Manor Educational Farm. Donnamarie has been working at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm since 2016, after over 30 years in photojournalism as a photo editor, and you will see her pictures are beautiful. Her ongoing work of conserving the various collections at the manor, researching and uncovering the lives and identities of the enslaved and Indigenous people of Sylvester Manor is an integral part of the organization's mission to preserve, cultivate, and share the stories of all the people of Sylvester Manor. She has curated the exhibitions Women of the Manor, A Place in Pictures, and All That Has Been, Our Roots Revealed. Her work at Sylvester Manor also includes ongoing photography projects relating to the memory of slavery felt in the landscape. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Donnamarie Barnes presenting The Enslaved at Sylvester Manor, revealing their stories through landscape and memory.
Thank you, Meredith, and good evening, everyone. And again, thank you to the Dyckman Farmhouse for inviting me to speak tonight to you. Again, I'm presently on the eastern end of Long Island in the town of Sag Harbor, but I am very familiar with the Dyckman Street area and Inwood and Riverdale, as I went to school there, and I still live in Riverdale part-time. So to all of my friends there in the Bronx, I wish you hello, and I'm so happy that so many from Shelter Island are joining us this evening. As Meredith mentioned, I am the archivist and curator at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, which is located on Shelter Island on the eastern end of Long Island. But I grew up nearby in Sag Harbor, as I said, where I am now. And growing up here, I lived in the historic African-American community of Nineveh. It's part of what we call the Sands communities of African-American residents who have been here since the end of World War II. And growing up here, I never knew, or I'd never been taught, that there was slavery on the eastern end of Long Island. So in 2014, when I, by chance, at my job at People magazine, picked up a book that was called The Manor, 300 Years of a Slave Plantation on Long Island by Matt Griswold, and saw that it was talking about a place on Shelter Island, I had no idea that this history existed. And that's a phrase that we hear often. How come I didn't know? I was never taught this history. That there was slavery in the North, that there was slavery in New York, that there was slavery on the eastern Long Island. But that is, in fact, the facts. And Sylvester Manor originated with its European settlers as what we call a provisioning plantation. Today, we are a not-for-profit organization. And as Meredith mentioned, our mission is to preserve, cultivate, and share historic Sylvester Manor, ensuring that land and food remain connected to the community and the arts. This property has descended through 12 generations of the same European family, the Sylvesters, and up until 2006 was a private home. The last heirs made the grand gesture of making the decision to give the property away. At the present, we oversee 235 acres of land, an historic 1737 Georgian-style manor house, a historic 1810 windmill, which has recently been gorgeously renovated, an organic farm where we have a very successful CSA program and farm stand, and where we employ young farmers to be apprentices to work on this historic property. Telling the stories of all of the people of Sylvester Manor, of the enslaved Africans, of the indigenous Manhattan people who were the native people of Shelter Island and part of the tribal system of Eastern Long Island, can sometimes be difficult, because although this property remained in the same family for so many years, the documentation of these other people, of the people of color, of this place is very much lacking beyond names listed on documents and on lists. But from what we have, from the names, and as Meredith said, one of the most important things is to say their names and then to imagine them in the place. And so in this presentation, I'd like to show you a little bit of what Sylvester Manor is about. Okay. Meredith, if you could start.
Is it not letting you advance?
No, it's not.
Well, isn't that
A slight technical.
okay? Hold on one second.
Okay.
I wonder if you want me to
Maybe I'll just do it again.
yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay.
Okay. Now I don't have a screen share button because you took it.
Hold on one second.
Excuse us, folks, just a slight technical hitch.
Let's see here.
We had this so together in the rehearsal.
Yes.
Before all of you arrived.
So can you click stop sharing on your picture?
No, it doesn't say stop sharing.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, wait. Hang on. Click to close message.
Let's see. I'm gonna,
This is terrible when you have a presentation that is very visually dependent and your visuals don't want to visualize.
want to participate?
They don't want to participate.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to see if I can share it the way you sent it to me yesterday.
Okay, it's different. Anyway, okay, I will talk and we will get that together and we will come back to look at it.
Great.
How's that sound? Okay. Okay. What you were going to see was the entrance to Sylvester Manor Educational Farm. And what I wanted to say was when I first arrived here as a visitor, I, again, had no idea that this history existed in this place. And so I was coming to it completely in a state of wonder. And driving onto the grounds, you are filled with this sense of wonder and mystery and magic and this feeling that the outside world is slipping away and that there are stories to be revealed here. Because I'm not a historian, I am, as we mentioned, I have worked most of my life in the photography business and as a photo editor and photo historian. And Meredith, are they advancing now?
Yes.
Okay, they're small on my screen.
Hold on 1 second. Whoop. Well, why did you do that?
Ah, isn't
How's
that lovely? Okay, but I can't advance it.
No, I will.
Okay.
Just let me know when you're ready.
Okay, I'm just going to nod my head to you. Okay.
Great.
So again, as you drive into Sylvester Manor, you are surrounded by woodlands that feel like you are in an ancient forest and the world is dropping away from you. And you are surrounded by magic and mystery and a feeling that you want to know what the stories are that are held here because there is a presence that's felt. Next. Okay. Sylvester Manor, as I said, was the ancestral home of the indigenous people, the Manhansets. And they made their home here for thousands of years. They farmed the land, they fished the waters, and they were part of an extensive tribal system on the eastern Long Island with the Montaukets and the Shinnecocks. In 1651, 4 partners arrived at the island and announced that they had bought the island for 1,600 pounds of sugar that they paid to a Connecticut merchant who had bought it from the English earl who had been granted the island by King Charles I, although none of them had ever set foot here. These 4 partners owned sugar plantations on the island of Barbados in the West Indies. And because sugar had become such a profitable commodity when introduced to Europe, they were making so much money that none of the land on their plantations was devoted to the growing of food or for provisions for the workforce who were transported enslaved Africans. And so the partners knew that they needed to import what they needed and, had the idea that what they would do was to have an alternate location to provision themselves. And so they bought Shelter Island, the 8,000 acres of Shelter Island, and paid for it in sugar. But when they arrived, you can go to the next slide. When they arrived, they found the Manhansett people, and the next one, who they told that they had bought the island. And the Manhansett, having had enough exposure to Europeans, knew that they had some legal recourse. And so they took the partners to court and sued them. And unbelievably, they won their suit. And so these 4 partners were forced to rebuy the island from the Manhansets, this time paying them 800 pounds of sugar. Next. The youngest partner was 30-year-old Nathaniel Sylvester. He was an Englishman, and he and his brother, who was also one of the partners, had been born and raised in Amsterdam. And so his connection to the Dutch Netherlands and the Dutch people was very important in buying this place in New York, which was still going back and forth between the English and the Dutch. Nathaniel was directed to build a house and to start to farm the land, harvest the timber, to make barrel staves for the molasses to be stored in at the plantations in Barbados. He brought with him enslaved Africans to work these projects. Next slide. Okay. To work the land and create what really was a very bustling commercial enterprise. Next slide. Can you advance it? Thank you. Okay. So through archaeology that was done at the manor in the early 2000s, next, you can go, we know that there were many buildings and workplaces throughout the property. The archaeology was done by a team from the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and they spent several summers, including the summer of 2019, doing digs in various places throughout the property and in the manor core. They collected almost close to 1 million artifacts, and it's from these artifacts that we learn a lot of what we know about what life was like here at Sylvester Manor in those early years of the provisioning plantation. Next, please. And the next. This cobblestone drive was uncovered and indicates that this was, again, a commercial enterprise, and therefore a stone drive was needed to transport the goods from one part of a field to another and to the waterfront where it would be then shipped to the West Indies. Next, please. From the artifacts, again, they don't really indicate precise indications of enslaved people or the work that they did or who they were as individuals. From the artifacts, we can infer that these were used by the enslaved people, the European family, And among them are the sewing needles, the thimbles, and the straight pins, which are an indication of the work of women. Nathaniel's wife was a 16-year-old girl whose name, unfortunately, was Grizzle. And when she arrived at Shelter Island, she had come straight from London and had no experience in running a house or living in the wilderness. And so she brought with her own property 3 enslaved African people, a couple, Hannah and her husband Jacaro, and their young daughter Hope. We don't know anything about them other than their names, and that they were among the original inhabitants of Shelter Island who came with the Sylvesters. And therefore, we regard Hannah, Jacaro, and Hope as the first Black family of Shelter Island. They had an additional daughter at Sylvester Manor who they named Isabel, and we believe her to be among the first of the African descended children born on the island. You can go to the next slide, thank you. Again, from the artifacts, we have to imagine the lives of these people living in this place in 1651. The clay pipes, the nails used to build the various buildings, the bricks, the yellow Dutch bricks that were brought from Amsterdam to help build a house. All of these are indications of labor. And because we know that the labor force were enslaved people brought here against their will, these are their artifacts, these are their memories, and these are the things that they have left behind for us to be able to envision this story and to be able to now share it today. Next, please. Among the people whose names that we know were 2 African people named Tomaru and Oyo. We believe that both of them had been born in Africa and transported to Barbados before being brought to Shelter Island, to this incredibly foreign land where the isolation and the change of weather must have just been unimaginable to endure. Next, please. Among the most important of the artifacts found by the archaeologists is this pot. And the significance of the pot is in how it was made. When it was analyzed, it was discovered that the design on it was a traditional indigenous Native American design that was used by local Native people, specifically Native women. So we can imagine that this pot was made by a Manhansed woman. However, when the clay was analyzed, it was discovered that the technique used was not something that Native people did because they did not fire their clay. West Africans did, specifically in Nigeria, where Oyo was from. Additionally, this pot has the evidence of a handle, which you can see, which was not indicative or traditional of Manhansed or African pottery. It's a European device. And so this pot was made by a native Manhansed woman, aided by an enslaved African woman, both in the service of a white European woman. It is unique to Shelter Island. It is unique to Sylvester Manor. And our lead archaeologist from UMass Boston, Dr. Stephen Mrzowski, calls it jazz. Because it is just something that can only be found here at Sylvester Manor. It returned to the manor in 2019 for the exhibition, All That Has Been, Our Roots Revealed. And when we set it up on the display and photographed it, it was a moment that really caught our breath because it looked so majestic and magnificent. And it felt so right to have it finally returned to the house and to be on display here. And from this pot, in telling the story of the pot, as I do whenever I give a tour, but seeing it back in the house and in the place where it was found on the lawn, made me wonder just how it came to be there. It was found pretty much as you see it here, intact, except for this one missing piece. And it made me imagine who it was that dropped it there and what were the circumstances. in believing that possibly Oyo was the woman who made the pot. Was it her? Was it her daughter? Was it some other enslaved woman who had to tote this pot back and forth into the house, carrying whatever it was it carried, water, seeds, grain, meats, whatever it was, some symbol of the work that she had to do, until one day she could carry it no further. And the only avenue open to her in her resistance or her defiance, or to satisfy her anger, her temper, her feeling of frustration, she dropped it in the mud. And it lay there for almost 400 years until we uncovered it. And now that we're able to display it and talk about it, it is evidence of that one day in Sylvester Manor's history when the pot went into the ground. Next, please. When Nathaniel Sylvester died in 1680, in his last will and testament, he left a list of the enslaved people, and he grouped them by families, bequeathing their children to his children. And he and Grizzle had 11 children who survived to adulthood. Possibly that was due to the fact that Grizzle's enslaved woman, Hannah, had been a young mother when she came to Shelter Island. So maybe she had knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth and was able to help in rearing the children. These family groups are the only real listings and mentions we have of these enslaved people. Several of them do show up again on a 1698 census for Southold and Shelter Island. But other than that, there is no documentation recording what their lives were like, where they came from, or what happened to them. Despite the fact that within the manor house, thousands and thousands of letters and documents and records remained, illustrating the lives of the Sylvester family. Next, please. The 1737 manor house was built by Nathaniel and Grizzle's grandson, Brindley Sylvester, and we believe that it was in the attic of the house where the enslaved and indentured people lived. Again, today, there is no real evidence of their existence here, but their sense of belonging here, of being here, is very strong. And going there and being in this space and photographing in this space, I feel their presence. Next, please. And next. Okay. One of the women who did work in the house was named Matilda. And she first appears on a 1765 inventory done from the Deering family, who were the proprietors and the family descendants at that time. We think in 1767, she may have been approximately 15 years old. During the Revolution, patriotic families from Long Island were forced to flee into exile in Connecticut, and many, including the Deerings at Sylvester Manor, left behind trusted enslaved people to watch the house and the land, and we believe Matilda may have been one of these people left behind. The British invaded, they occupied the property, the house, they cut down the trees for timber, for firewood, they decimated the farm. And when the Deerings returned, they rewarded Matilda by manumitting her in 1795. In her freedom, she was able to build a house, but in order to do that, she was forced to borrow money from the Deering family who had enslaved her to build the house, upon land owned by the Deerings, for which she had to pay rent. So despite being a free woman now, she was forever indebted to the family that had first enslaved her. However, her name appears in the 1810 census as a free woman of color and the head of her household and a member of the Presbyterian Church. Next, please. Okay. Matilda is last mentioned on the census in 1820, and after that, there is no documentation of her. We don't know whether or not she had descendants, and at present, we don't have any evidence or we don't have any connections to a descendant community from the enslaved Africans who worked and lived at Sylvester Manor and who died there There is on the property an area that is called the Afro-Indigenous Burial Ground. And because of the work done by the archaeologists with ground penetrating radar, we know that within this fence, there are 200 people interred. They are laid to rest here without tombstones or headstones, but only markers of large field stones and mounds in the landscape that you can just barely see. Next, please. Within the manor house, again, to tell these stories of the family, of the European family that descended here again through 12 generations, but also the presence of the people who worked here, the enslaved people, the indentured people, the immigrant people who came to Shelter Island to be employed here, is evident throughout the house. Next. And on the back staircase, which we call the slave staircase, it spirals to the first floor bedrooms and then to the attic space above where the enslaved and the indentured lived. These names placed on the stairs are the names of the enslaved women. And when I curated the exhibition that was called Women of the Manor, I didn't have images to illustrate these women. I only had their names. And so we placed them here in permanent tribute to the enslaved women of Sylvester Manor, who went up and down these stairs, which are spiraling and deep set, doing all kinds of work. Next, please. And next. Throughout the landscape, as I walk it and photograph there, again, the feeling of presence is everywhere, and the feeling of mystery and magic is what I call it. And when I'm trying to be inspired of how to tell a story, and I take a walk and take photographs, I can feel the way forward and how to do it. Next, please. The sense of beauty here, of nature, is overwhelming. But at the same time, within this beauty is the fact that beginning in 1651, when enslaved African people were brought here from the Caribbean, this was such an alien place. The seasons were something they had never encountered or experienced before. The landscape in all of its beauty was actually a prison. They were on an island surrounded by two forks of another island in the middle of the sea. There was no escape for these people. There was no place to go. There was no way out. And so within this beauty of nature, they were trapped. Next, please. When you walk here among the trees and in the quiet of nature, it's very easy to imagine these stories and these lives, and their presence is felt even today. And it's part of the mission of Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, that we represent them, that we bring their stories to life, that we imagine them here. Next, please. The burying ground, as I said, is filled with unmarked graves. But in 1884, descendants of the Sylvester family, the Horsefords, placed this stone here in front of the burying ground, and it reads, "The burying ground of the colored people of Sylvester Manor since 1651. Visitors coming to the manor place stones and flowers at this memorial stone. And this year, more than ever, when the manor house could not be open to visitors, and people came to visit only by walking the trails and through the woods, and to visit at the burying ground, this took on a much more significant role in the presence of what we do. Because everyone had to come and walk and not just drive through to come for a tour, life here at the manor slowed down. And so I think many of our visitors for the first time really got to have that experience of walking through the nature here and of feeling all of the history that is imbued in this landscape. Next, please. One of the last person to be buried in the burying ground was a woman whose name was Julia Dyed Havens Johnson. And in this illustration, which was in a magazine article that was about Sylvester Manor, the caption reads, "One of the last of the slaves of the Sylvester Manor." Well, in fact, Julia was not an enslaved person. She was a freeborn woman. She was listed as a mulatto. Her mother, Dido, was enslaved, and her father was an unknown white man from Shelter Island. She lived and she worked at Sylvester Manor for over 3 generations. She had inherited 23 acres of prime land from her stepfather, who's a man named Comus Fanning, who had been enslaved on Shelter Island and in Southold, and was eventually manumitted, and was able to, through working various jobs, save enough money to buy 23 acres of prime land from the Deering family. The land was just north of the manor border. Julia did many odd jobs as domestic, as a nurse. She sold firewood. She raised turkeys. And she was paid very little. And little by little, she sold off her land back to the family from Sylvester Manor at far below market value. Next slide, please. She was photographed for that magazine article, and this is the only image that we have of Julia. And in fact, it's the only image that we have of any person of color who had lived at Sylvester Manor. She is buried in the burying ground as per her wishes, and she passed away at over 90 years of age, approximately 1908. Next, please. Again, this is the burying ground. And next. Excuse me. Again, coming to the Sylvester Manor, I'm walking the grounds, visiting the farmland, going through the trails, the burial grounds, and the manor house. The sense of history, of the long history of almost 400 years and longer through the Manhasset people, is all around us. And it is, again, our mission to preserve, cultivate, and share all of the history and to tell the story of all of the people. Last slide. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, we will take them now. Okay.
There we go. Those photographs were beautiful.
Thank you. And I apologize that it didn't technically work out the way that we had run through, but it worked out okay.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a question here that says, why was this location chosen for the provisioning plantation when it is so far from Barbados?
Very good question. Well, at the time, the early 1650s, on Barbados and within the British Empire, I must say, the English Civil War was going on, and these 4 partners, although they were wildly successful, making enormous amounts of money, were they were not royalist. And so and the island of Barbados was divided between the parliamentarians and the royalists. And for a portion of the time during the war, the partners found themselves on the wrong side. And so they were worried that they were going to be arrested and that their lands were going to be confiscated. And so for 2 reasons, they decided to buy this location. 1, to provision them, and 2, to be a safe hideout for them in case they needed to bolt from Barbados. Shelter Island on the eastern end of Long Island was geographically sort of central to having a triangle trade of coming from the West Indies to the Northeast and then back to Europe, back to England and the Netherlands as well. So that's why they bought it. And they also got it at the Hamptons Real Estate bargain basement price of 1,600 pounds of sugar.
Okay, the next question is, what can you tell us about the descendants of the enslaved workers on Shelter Island and about the descendants of the indigenous people?
Ooh, really good questions. At the present, we don't have any connection to descendants of the enslaved community, or direct descendants to the indigenous community. We do have very strong ties with the Shinnecock Nation in Southampton. When the Manhattans left Shelter Island after they sold it to Nathaniel Sylvester, they did intermingle with other Eastern Long Island tribes, the Shinnecock, the Montaukets, that they were already aligned with. And we don't have, at the present, any real ties to specific descendants. However, when members from Shinnecock come to Sylvester Manor or come to Shelter Island, they often say that they feel very strong ties. The image of the wigwam that I showed earlier in the slideshow was a project that we did in 2019. It is a native wigwam that was constructed by artisans from the Shinnecock Nation. And it was the first wigwam, which is a traditional native dwelling. It was the first wigwam built on Shelter Island by native people using materials that were harvested directly from the property in 400 years. It's 2 years has passed since we built it. It has been allowed to sort of fall apart as it would naturally, because that's what would happen to a wigwam. The winter snow this year has been a little bit worse for wear, but it is still standing.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, what were the indigenous people around Sylvester Manor doing during this time? Could the enslaved Africans escape to their communities?
I don't know of any stories of enslaved people escaping to indigenous communities. I wouldn't be surprised if there were. The Manhattans that remained on the property or on Shelter Island did work for Sylvester Manor, whether that was by choice or by coercion, or whether that was a circumstance of allowing them to stay after the sale from the Manhattans and the agreement that they would abandon the island. So there's still so much research to be done, and we're really starting to sort of broaden our scope of research to the greater Shelter Island historical records and the neighboring towns and villages.
Great. Okay. The next question says, as you say, the picture of Joya is the only picture you have of someone from the manor. She passed in 1908. Are you able to trace the descendants of any of the enslaved, or is this ongoing work? You may have already touched on this a little bit.
Yes, it is ongoing work. Julia did have a son who we believe went to sea as a whaler. Sag Harbor, which is just across the water from Shelter Island, was an historic whaling town, and several men of color, enslaved men as well as free men of color post-emancipation, did go to sea as whalers. And we believe that Julia's son was among them and possibly had perished on a whaling voyage. There's no other documentation about him.
Okay, the next question is, are the objects found through the archaeological digs on display at the manor?
Due to the pandemic, which seems to be a stock phrase now, due to the pandemic, we were unable to continue the exhibition in the season of 2020. The artifacts are housed in Boston at the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research, which the widow of the 10th generation heir, Alice Fisk, endowed in honor of her husband. So the artifacts are kept there. They were to return in 2020 to be on display again, in addition to the artifacts that were found during the 2019 dig, excuse me. We are hoping, when we are able to open again, possibly in 2022, to extend the exhibition and bring the artifacts back once again.
Great. The next question says, why was the burial ground in that specific location?
I don't know. And that's a question that I ask a lot. It is in close proximity to the house. The assumption is that it may have been already a burial ground used by the Manhansett people, so it was an indigenous burial ground that was then just used to also bury the enslaved people. But it is a mystery that it is in close proximity to the manor core, to the house. There was another cemetery at a farther distance on the property, like a quarter mile from the house, where early family members were buried and where there is a monument to Nathaniel Sylvester. But why the Afro-Indigenous burial ground is where it is, we don't yet know, except to think that it is possibly the site of an original Indigenous burial ground. We are going to do more research this fall. The archaeological team are coming back to do more advanced ground penetrating radar in the area of the burying ground to see whether it extends beyond the area delineated by the fence across the drive, and to do some spot digging, not to disinter or to disturb any of the graves, but to just investigate just how extensive the burial ground could be.
Fascinating.
So all of you, we're all invited. Well, of course, all the Shelter Island people who are on, you're coming anyway. But hopefully this summer when travel is a little bit easier and everybody who's in the city wants to get out of the city, you'll come to the east end of Long Island, visit us on Shelter Island.
Sounds great. I would love to. Okay, the next question is, were Native Americans also enslaved? If so, did they live with the Caribbean slaves?
Ooh, great questions. We don't have any direct evidence to say that the Manhansett people were enslaved in the same way. But again, their names do appear on accounts and records from the property as doing work, and that they were paid nominally in small coins, cider, firewood, etc. So again, we don't yet know whether one of the conditions for the Manhansett staying on Shelter Island and at the manor core was that they had to work for the property. We do have evidence of two Montaukett Native American boys who were indentured. Slavery in New York ends in 1827. Again, one of those facts that we weren't taught in school. In 1828, two young Montaukett Native American boys were brought to Sylvester Manor and indentured by their mother, who could not support them any longer. They were 5 and 8 years old. And we know that their names were William and Isaac Farrow, and that they lived in the attic. And the evidence of their living there is on the walls itself, because they drew carvings of ships from the time they were little boys. Their indenture was to last till they were 25 years old. And as I say, when they arrived, they were 5 and 8. They were little kids. But they continuously drew these ships on the wall, carved them. In 1841, the eldest boy, William, was 19 years old. He had a year and a half left to go on his indenture, but he ran away one night to sea, leaving behind his 16-year-old brother, Isaac, who remained at the manor for the rest of his life. So the evidence of these two boys in the attic is all that we really have to point to that this was a space of living. And they are permanently remembered there.
Okay, the next question is, would the activities or lives of the enslaved people at Shelter Island have been similar to the enslaved in New Amsterdam and colonial New York? Also, would the burying practices, i.e. unmarked graves, have been similar?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that the practice was probably very much similar. And the use of large field stones to mark the graves. And perhaps we will find in the next archaeological dig and surveys more evidence. Artifacts may be buried in the ground and such. the experience of the enslaved on Eastern Long Island is something that has very much been in the conversations lately. And Sylvester Manor and I are also involved in a work that we call the Plain Side Project, which we started in East Hampton, and the purpose of which is to find, name, and count the enslaved people of the East End of Long Island, starting at the very beginning of the establishments of the East End towns, the Hamptons. This project was started in East Hampton, and at the present, for East Hampton, we have uncovered over 300 names of enslaved people for a period of approximately 128 years. Added to that, the names at Sylvester Manor, and another project that's being done on the North Fork, where they have uncovered up to another 300 names. We are close to 1,000 names of enslaved people that we find documentation for, starting in 1640, basically, through 1828.
That's amazing.
That's amazing. It's an amazing number. And oftentimes all we have, as we have at Sylvester Manor, are the names listed on a list, on a last will and testament, on an inventory, in an account book. But just finding those names gives them personhood, gives them agency, and acknowledging them and saying their names and imagining those lives is acknowledging their importance to this history that is the history of the United States. This is American history that was just not told.
Yep. So true. Okay, we've got a few more questions for you.
Oh.
Do we know what kind of diet the enslaved would have eaten at the manor? Since they were close to the water, did they bring any traditional knowledge of fishing with them?
Wow, that's I hate to say we don't know, because we don't really know, except what we know from the land itself. We know that this was a provisioning plantation. We know from a trash heap that was uncovered in the archaeology that there was evidence of livestock, that they were raising hogs, they were slaughtering cattle, there were sheep. The Manhasset people obviously had a tradition of fishing in the waters, clams, quahogs, mussels, lobsters. So there was an abundance of natural seafood to be had. Specifically, any crops they were growing, we don't know for certain, but this has always been farmland, and we continue to farm today. Moving forward, we, in partnership with the Shinnecock and their food traditions, we are going to investigate more about what might have been traditional crops, and possibly try to regrow them and to have programs about food and foodways.
I love it. Okay, has any effort been made to connect the history of Sylvester Manor to other nearby Long Island or Connecticut homes?
Yes, funny you should ask that question. We have a connection, and it's the subject of my next talk on Sunday, which is the Sylvester Manor Black History Month event. We have a connection with Lloyd's Manor in Queens Village. The two enslaved people that I talked about, Tamro and Oyo, who may have made the pot, Tamro, who more than likely was born in Nigeria and Africa. We are able to connect their family, their children. They had 4 children. And when Nathaniel Sylvester died, their children were bequeathed to Nathaniel's children. And one of his eldest daughters had married a man named James Lloyd, who owned the land or inherited the land when he married, that Lloyd's Manor was built on. Tamara and Oyo's children, specifically their son Obium, was used as currency to pay a debt that the Sylvester family owed to the Lloyd family. And so Obium was sent to live in their home in Boston. And eventually he came back to Long Island to Lloyd's Manor, where he married another enslaved woman. Somewhere along the way, he learned to read and write. and he signed his name in a prayer book that he owned. The prayer book has since been lost. However, his son, he and his wife Rose had a son that they called Jupiter. And Jupiter Hammond went on to become the first published African-American poet. And so our talk on Sunday is going to be about this connection between the Sylvesters and the Lloyds and the 3 generations of this African enslaved family that we can trace.
Amazing. I love it. Okay, there was a long transition between slavery and freedom in Connecticut and much of eastern Long Island. Were many of the first generation of free children of former enslaved individuals on Shelter Island bound out as was found elsewhere?
That I'm not really sure. The last person enslaved at Sylvester Manor was manumitted in 1820, so 7 to 8 years before emancipation in New York. So at the manor, there was not the gradual sort of manumitting or emancipation of enslaved people. The last man, London was his name, was freed in 1820. He does then go on to show up in census records of Shelter Island. He takes the last name Ward, so his name was London Ward. And there are several generations of his descendants who then also fall off from the records. Post-slavery on Eastern Long Island, we see disbursement of people of color. And whether that was economic, they were moving to more urban areas further west on Long Island or into the city or Brooklyn to find work. We're not really sure, but post-emancipation, the population of people of color of African descent does decrease.
Okay. Has the story of the enslaved people at Sylvester Manor always been included in the interpretation of the site?
Yes, it has. From the very beginning, again, we became a not-for-profit organization in 2009, so it's not a long time. However, throughout the generations and into modern times, as I said, the last full-time resident lived at the manor until 2006. It was always an acknowledged fact that this was a place of enslavement. And those stories, as we became an organization, were always imperative to tell. I know that a lot of historical organizations and sites are now starting to deal with and incorporate and interpret their history of enslavement, because if you were a farm, a historic home, any large property that can date back to certainly to the 17th century and through the 18th century, you were more than likely a place of enslavement. And whether or not that history was part of your interpretation and part of the public offering, that's now being addressed in many, I would say most historic sites throughout New York.
Yeah. Has Sylvester Manor found any bundles in the eaves of the house in other historic homes in the area? Such bundles with African artifacts such as beads have been found, believed to have been put there by enslaved people.
No. And I've looked. There are so many things in the house, but just the collections. But no, there is no evidence that we have found of enslaved people.
Okay.
Except to say that the cobblestone photo that I showed, it is a practical device. It was needed because it was a muddy landscape and they were transporting goods from one part of the property to the other. So it had a utility. However, within this cobblestone, there are patterns to be discerned. And if the enslaved people were those who were constructing it took some skill, it took some craft to do this. This was not just like throw some rocks onto a surface willy-nilly. There is a an organization, a geometrical organization. Whether or not that has some meaning or tradition that can be traced back to Africa, I'm not sure.
Someone wrote, "What about the estate of William Floyd in Mastic?"
Yes.
I don't know what.
Yeah, well, it is another estate. I don't know their history specifically, but I would imagine that it was also a place of enslavement.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So there are 2 more questions that it looks like that we'll tackle, and then we'll let you go about your evening. Let's see. Someone wants to know if there's any evidence of the physical treatment of the enslaved people at the manor.
At the manor, no. There's no record of how they were treated, whether it was with violence or with care or anything. There was no record among the thousands and literally tens of thousands of documents and papers that were housed in the manor house about the history that spanned, close to 400 years.
No.
There was no record of what the lives of the enslaved people was like, or what a daily account was, other than just to list their name and possibly a payment that was made to them as free people. And I get asked that question often. Right. And even though we don't have evidence of malevolence towards these people, the very fact that they were held in bondage, that they were held against their will, that they were brought against their will to this place, as beautiful as it is, and kept in this isolation and forced to stay there, is cruelty enough. The very act of being enslaved is the cruelty. Anything that comes after it doesn't really matter.
Okay, so someone says there was recently a reconstruction of a windmill on Sylvester Manor, or maybe they mean Shelter Island. Was that used or built by the Sylvester family / enslaved? It's it's a very eye-catching structure.
Yes, it is. And if my slideshow had worked the way I wanted it to, there would have been a picture of it. But yes, the historic windmill that is in the field at the farm at Sylvester Manor was built in 1806 by the master craftsman millwright Nathaniel Donnamarie. It was originally built in Southold, moved to the center of Shelter Island in 1848, I believe, and it was used till the turn of the century. During World War I, it was put back into operation to grind flour and wheat for the town during the food shortages. Two Horsford sisters, Lillian and Cornelia Horsford, bought it from the town to preserve it as a historical artifact. And Cornelia moved it to what we call the Windmill field in the 1920s. The blades originally broke off during a hurricane. They were restored by Andrew Fisk in the 1950s and 1952. But again, those blades were destroyed in a hurricane. And so for the last 2 years, we have been engaged in a restoration project to have a new shaft installed and have the blades and what they're called sails put back onto the windmill. And just in the last 2 weeks, that work has been completed.
Wow. That's great. All right. I think we've answered all of the questions. I mean, this has been so great, and I've loved listening to all the questions and all the beautiful photos, and I can't wait to come and visit you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. So I hope everyone enjoyed the talk. Please consider donating to the organization. We greatly appreciate it. Also, just a reminder that this is the 4th in our series of 6 lectures. So please join us back here next Wednesday, which is March 3rd. Wow, February really flew by. at 6 p.m. for Black Dance and Music Connections with Jazz Power Initiative, who's one of our neighbors here in Inwood, with Eli Yamin and Shireen Jackson. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for having me.
Thanks, Donnamarie. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.